All right, well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to, I guess we're in week 4 now of PPA 500. It's kind of hard to believe it's already week number 4, but that's what it's looking like. So these hybrid courses do go by very, very quickly. And I think you're kind of getting a feel for the pacing of the course already. So we are moving along relatively quickly. So I hope everyone is doing well. Thank you very much for the draft advancement to candidacy forms and all those have been submitted as of about an hour ago. Gone through and taken a look at those and pretty much no issues. If there are any issues, I wrote that in the feedback box when I said back to you, but they all look really good. Also, thank you for Canvas essay number 2. I think everyone did a really nice job of identifying 3 of those 8 principles in the ASPA Code of Ethics. So I was very happy with that. Coming due next week, you have Canvas essay number 3. And Canvas essay number 3, if you haven't looked at it yet, will draw upon some of the information we're going to talk about tonight in terms of public versus private sectors. And so for Canvas essay number 3, what you'll be doing is you'll be comparing a public organization to a corollary organization in the private sector. And you'll be identifying 2 similarities between the public and private organization, and then 2 differences between the public and the private organization. Now, if you are working in a nonprofit organization, then you can talk about nonprofit and compare it to private sector organization. If you're working in a private organization, you can just reverse the logic and just compare the private sector organization to a public organization. If you're not currently working in an organization, that's fine as well. You can just select an organization maybe you've worked with in the past, or an organization you're familiar with, or one that you have interest in, and then use that as a topic for Canvas essay number 3. So 2 similarities and 2 differences between public and private organization. And then, as always, responding to 2 of the postings from classmates. So that is then what is due next Tuesday, and that's Canvas essay number 3. 2 weeks from tonight, you have your midterm assessment due. And when we started the course, we talked about the syllabus. I introduced you to this idea of the midterm assessment, and I told you that 2 weeks before the midterm assessment would be due, I would open it up on our Canvas site. And so I opened it up over the weekend. So if you haven't seen yet, the midterm assessment is open and available for you to start working on at your leisure. You have 2 weeks, and so you have until, I guess it's the 25th at midnight to submit that midterm assessment. But I think it's always a good idea, and I found this a good practice to, in class, actually go through the midterm assessment, talk about why it's an assessment, the scenarios on the assessment, the types of questions you're going to be answering, and then what the expectations are for your answers to those questions. I think it's really nice for us as a group to kind of sit down, go through the midterm assessment so everyone's kind of understands what they're being required to do and what's being asked of them. So I know it takes up a little bit of class time, but I think it's important that we start out tonight going through the midterm assessment. I've shared it with you, so it's up there on the screen. Hopefully you can see it. So this is an assessment, and so it's not an examination. So there's no rote memorization that is required for this. It is, I guess, what we used to call open book, in that you can use any of the material at your disposal to answer these questions. You can use material that we cover in our sessions here on Tuesday evenings. You can use material from the Kettle textbook, from the articles in the classics textbook. If you'd like to use outside information and you want to use external sources, you can do that. That's certainly allowable, but it's not required, because this is truly an assessment. And as an assessment mechanism, the whole goal of this midterm assessment is just to assess your acquisition of the skills and the concepts and the competencies from what we have covered up to this point in the class. So you do not have to do outside research unless you would like to. If you are doing outside research, a good question from Jacob in TextJet, if you're doing outside research, then yes, you would want to include a works cited page and include the citation for the source you use and include it in APA format. However, if you're only using information from what we cover on Tuesday evenings or from the books that we share in terms of Kettle and the classics text, you don't have to include those citations because we all have access to that information. I know where to find that information. So you don't have to cite information from the textbooks or from what we cover on Tuesday evenings. But if you're using something, journal articles or something from the library, then yes, you would want to have a reference page and your citations in APA format. So as an assessment, again, we're just trying to assess how you've acquired the skills and the concepts that are supposed to be delivered in this PPA 500 course. So that's why it's considered to be an assessment. Since we have a scenario-based assessment, there are no necessarily right or wrong answers. Your answers will be evaluated based upon your ability to justify your answer. So there is no best answer. And I think this is a good moral of the story for the entire study of public administration. There really are no best answers that fit in every single situation. Instead of looking for the best answer, we are instead looking for the most appropriate answer. So what theories or what concepts are most appropriate to fit this scenario? So you're looking for the most appropriate as opposed to the best. And then as such, what I'll be doing is just looking at your justification for why you believe this is the most appropriate way to approach this problem. Now, in terms of the length of your responses, as I've said many times in this class, I'm a really big believer in parsimony. This is public administration, so it's important for us to be as concise as we can possibly be. And so I'm looking at maybe 1 to 2 paragraphs for each one of the answers. For each question, your answer should be about 1 or 2 paragraphs. You don't really have to go beyond that in order to do an adequate job of answering the questions. So be as concise and parsimonious as you can be. So for these 5 scenarios, as you'll see, some of them are truly scenarios, some of them are more prompts than they really are scenarios, but they're meant to provide you with just enough information to be able to answer the questions. I don't want to inundate you with a lot of superfluous details, but I do want to provide you with the information that you need in order to properly select which concepts and theories from the class would be most appropriate to address that scenario or prompt. And each one of the scenarios or prompts, they will look at a different topic area that we have covered up to this point in time, including next week in class. So you have a scenario on the foundations of American democracy. That's the first one. You have a scenario on accountability and ethics. That's the second one. You have a scenario on public-private differences. That's the third one, and that's what we'll talk about here tonight. You have a scenario on the study of public administration as a discipline, and you have that as scenario number 4. And then the 5th and final scenario looks at the theoretical approaches to studying public organizations. That is information that we will cover next week. So by the end of class tonight, you'll have all the information that you need to address scenarios 1, 2, and 3. And then after class next week, you'll have the information you need for scenarios 4 and 5. And then you'll have everything at the end of class next week in order to answer all 5 of the scenarios on the midterm assessment. So when we talk about scenarios 4 and 5, we haven't gotten to that information yet. We'll get to that information in class next week. So scenario number 1. This is our foundations of American democracy. So as discussed in class, the Constitution received ratification from the requisite number of states relatively quickly. However, New York was slow to ratify. As we talked about in class, we had 10 states that ratified the new Constitution within just a little bit over a year. You only needed 9 states in order to make the Constitution go into effect. You had 10. But of those 10 states, New York was not one of them. And as we had talked about, New York was really the linchpin of commerce in the colony. So if you're going to have a working constitution, you're going to have New York signing off on this new constitution and ratifying it. So the goal of developing the Bill of Rights and writing the 85 Federalist Papers was to convince the citizens of New York and the anti-federalists to support this new constitution. The work we currently do as public administrators is directly affected by these liberties and these freedoms that were incorporated into that Bill of Rights. So in question 1A, select 3 freedoms discussed in the Bill of Rights and discuss how these freedoms affect the work of public administrators. So you can talk about freedom of speech or freedom of press or right to peaceably assemble or freedom of religion, or you can talk about the right to counsel. You can talk about right to due process. You can talk about protections against double jeopardy or self-incrimination. It's up to you. Just select 3 freedoms from those first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and then relate that discussion to how they have an impact on the work of public administration. So, clearly, if you're talking about something like the right to counsel, the right to counsel has a direct impact upon law enforcement. So if you're a law enforcement officer and you're arresting someone, you have to Mirandize them. Because of Miranda versus Arizona, you have to tell them that they have the right to remain silent. They don't have to incriminate themselves. You tell them they have the right to counsel. If they cannot afford counsel, one will be appointed to them. So you have to tell them, make sure they're aware of these constitutional rights in the Bill of Rights. So that's kind of an example of how you can connect these freedoms to the work of public administrators. So that's 1A. Then in 1B, we're going to focus squarely on my favorite Federalist paper, which is Federalist paper number 39. And in class, when we talked about American government, we talked about Federalist 39 and the argument that James Madison makes in Federalist 39 to try and convince the anti-Federalists to not be afraid of this new Constitution and to support it and to ratify it, because this new Constitution, according to Madison and Federalist 39, would not create too strong of a national government. So Madison made this compelling argument for the new Constitution in Federalist 39. Select and discuss 3 arguments made by Madison in Federalist 39 to convince anti-Federalists to support the new Constitution. And again, for your reference, there's a link to the Federalist Papers and another link directly to Federalist number 39 if you want to go back and refresh your memory about what Madison said in Federalist 39. So answer to 1A, 1 to 2 paragraphs. Answer to 1B, 1 to 2 paragraphs. And that's scenario number 1. So that's our American government scenario. Then scenario 2 is truly a scenario. And this scenario looks at accountability and ethics, the information that we discussed in class last week. So the city of South Terra Verde is a quickly growing community adjacent to a large metropolitan area. South Terra Verde has decided to construct a large public park in the center of town to accommodate the recreation needs of its growing population. The City Council has been discussing the issue for the past 2 months and plans to discuss the purchase of land for this park again at their next council meeting, with a possible vote on the purchase also scheduled for this meeting. Now, if you do any support of city councils, you know that depending upon the rules that city councils operate under, some city councils adhere to Robert's Rules of Order. Here in Southern California, some city councils would adhere to other parliamentary procedures, such as Rosenberg rules. But depending on the rules they use, some rules will prohibit a city council from having a discussion and action item on the same agenda. So you'd have to have a discussion item, and then the next agenda, it would be an action item where you vote on it. So just for this scenario, assume that's not the case, and assume their rules permit discussion as well as action on the same issue on their agenda. So there's a council member named Mr. Hayes, and Council Member Hayes recently, as of last week, purchased a tract of land within the area for the proposed city park. Council Member Hayes plans to participate in the discussion and also to vote on the city's purchase of the land for the park. So Mr. Hayes is not going to recuse himself from either the discussion about the issue or voting on the issue. So in question 2A, if Mr. Hayes participates in the discussion and votes on the proposed land purchase, what principles in the ASPA Code of Ethics would this potentially violate and why? So this is something you've kind of been there and done that with Canvas essay number 3. So you're aware of the 8 principles. Here, you're just going to identify which of those 8 principles you think would be violated if Mr. Hayes participated in the discussion and then also voted on the land purchase. And then in 2B, are you concerned about Mr. Hayes's purchase of the land? Why or why not? Does it concern you that he's not recusing himself and that he's participating in this decision? So that's your accountability and ethics scenario. Then scenario number 3. This one gets us into the realm of public versus private provision and production of goods and services, which is our primary topic that we'll talk about tonight. So the Midtown Unified School District has seen its student population increase by 40% over the past 2 years. That's relatively unusual. A lot of school districts in the state and really across the entire nation are seeing their student populations go down in the wake of COVID-19. Some students, some parents, when they went online with virtual education, they decided to go to private schools and not go back to the school system. They've decided to, continue with independent study, but a lot of districts have seen their student population go down post-COVID. This is an exception to the rule because this growth is forecasted to continue for the next 10 years due to development within the district's jurisdiction. Obviously, as houses are built, they're going to produce students. Those students have to go somewhere. And so this district is assuming that this development is going to lead to higher levels of student enrollment. Every year, what school districts will do is they will approve what they call a housing report. And that housing report is a study that an independent consultant will do to give them an idea of how many students are being generated by new developments within their jurisdiction, so they can then use that information to forecast their enrollments into the future. So it looks like there are going to be very healthy enrollment increases in this district. So the district decides to construct a school on the east side of the city by funding the school with bonds, borrowing money. So they have to build new schools to accommodate this increase in student population. So the district decides they're going to build one school on the east side of the city. And in order to get the money to build that school, they're going to borrow those funds. Whenever local governments borrow money, they typically do it through the issuing of bonds. And so what they'll do is they'll issue a bond. Investors will then purchase those bonds, and then investors will make their money back plus interest earned. And then the money that investors pay to purchase the bond, what we call the bond proceeds, that money is then used to construct capital projects. So they're going to borrow the money to build this school. The construction costs for this school are estimated to be $65 million, and construction should take approximately 18 months. $65 million may sound like a large chunk of change, but today it's probably a little of an underestimate. When I was on the school board, actually, it was built before I was on the school board, but the most recent school that was built was a very nice school, a two-story school, but it cost $50 million. And that school was completed well over a decade ago. So with cost escalation, you can assume that $65 million is a pretty conservative estimate for the cost of the school. The district also entered into an agreement with the developer to construct another school on the western edge of the city. That second school on the western edge of the city will be completely built by the developer with little to no district interaction. So it's going to be completely done by the developer. That school being completely built by the developer will be identical to the school being built by the district to the east. And that school on the western side being built by the developer is estimated to cost $45 million and to take approximately 12 months to complete the project. So in question 3A, what explains the discrepancy in the time to completion and the cost between the two schools? So why do we have this difference in cost? Why do we have this difference in the amount of time to complete the projects? And then in 3B, what are some of the disadvantages to allowing a private sector developer to construct the school on the west side of the city? Essentially here, we're asking what are some of the disadvantages of complete privatization? And throughout our discussion tonight, we will talk about the proper role of government in the provision and production of projects and the provision and production of goods and services. And we'll talk about some of the disadvantages of completely turning a project over to the private sector, along with some of the advantages of doing so as well. So that is your public versus private differences type of a scenario. Then in scenario number 4, as we know, Woodrow Wilson's classic article, The Study of Administration, formed the basis for a separate field of the study of administration. One of the enduring concepts that emerged from that article was the idea of a politics-administration dichotomy. We have alluded to the politics-administration dichotomy before in class. We talked about it last week when we talked about accountability and ethics. We are going to talk about it again at length at the beginning of class next week. So you'll have all the information after next week to answer these questions. But in question 4A, describe Wilson's argument for why we need a separate study of public administration And then in 4B, describe the politics administration dichotomy and why this dichotomy is no longer as valid as it once may have been. So again, you'll be reading the Wilson article for next week. Wilson article is in the classics textbook, and then you'll be basing your answers on what we talk about next week, as well as your reading of the Wilson article. And then finally, our fifth scenario looks at the theoretical approaches to studying public organizations. The Department of Housing in the city of Tyler Heights is a large, old organization in the state of New Mexico. Its primary function is to make adequate and affordable housing available to income-eligible residents in the city. As an older organization, the Department of Housing has developed an extensive set of policies and procedures. Employees are held accountable and evaluated based upon how closely they adhere to these policies and procedures. Employee turnover is high as employees feel they are not valued and have few opportunities to develop their skills through training. There is also little vertical and horizontal communication occurring in the organization. So question 5A, select two classical organization theorists or theories that you feel would be beneficial for the organization and discuss why they would be beneficial. And then in 5B, select two neoclassical organization theories or theorists and discuss why they will be beneficial for the organization in its current situation. This is information that we are going to cover in the second part of class next week. And the second part of class next week, I will take you through a admittedly very quick overview of 150 years of theoretical perspectives on public organizations. Where we will start our discussion next week will be with classic organization theory. And so some of the articles you read, people like Max Weber. We'll talk about people like Frederick Taylor. We'll talk about people like Luther Gulick. Those are what we'll talk about as the classical types of theorists. Then we'll talk about more modern theories, what we consider to be the neoclassical theories. And neoclassical theories such as human relations theory, human resource management theory. And so we'll cover all this information on these theoretical approaches. I will introduce you to a good number of theorists. We're not obviously go through an entire discussion of all of them because we don't have the time for that, but I'll kind of hit the highlights of the major classical and neoclassical theorists that we have seen developed over the past 150 years. 5A, you'll select two of those classical theorists and why they're beneficial. And then in 5B, you'll select two of those more modern neoclassical theorists or theories and why they are beneficial. So that is the midterm assessment, 5 scenarios, 2 questions related to each scenario for a grand total of 10 questions on the assessment. The way in which I'll grade it is each of those questions will be worth 10 points. 10 times 10 is 100. So a grand total of 100 points for the entire assessment. Again, 1 to 2 paragraphs for each one of your answers to the question will certainly suffice to get the job done. As I said before, you do not have to use outside resources for this unless you want to, but you do not have to. You'll just be relying upon the information that we have covered and will have covered by the end of class next week. So any preliminary questions on the midterm assessment, any of the questions or the scenarios on the assessment?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Do we have to have a like a cover page or title page?
No, you do not for this. And in fact, probably the easiest way to do this is to just download the assessment that I have up on the Canvas site, and then you can just type your answers directly into this document. And so whenever you're ready to answer, question 1A, just put your answer right in there. And if you can use a different color, if you want to use red or blue or whatever you like, just make it stand out a little bit from the question, but type your answers directly onto this, save it, and then you can upload it directly on the Canvas site. As you begin thinking about answering some of these questions, between now and next week, if you have any questions or need any clarifications, as always, feel free to send me an email. I'm more than happy to answer any of the questions that you may have, and we'll get back to you very quickly, certainly probably within a few hours, if not a few minutes. So I will respond to any questions that you have. Obviously not questions like what's the right answer, clearly, but just clarifications, what I'm looking for. I'm happy to answer any of those questions. And then also next week, when we get together again next Tuesday night, we'll reserve a little bit of time to address any further questions that you have after you've had a chance to really think through some of these scenarios. All right. Let me stop that share then, and let me go ahead and share out our slides for tonight, looking at public versus private sectors. And put that in presentation view. There we go. But before we jump into that, I do want to kind of do a little epilogue on what we talked about last week, because things are changing very quickly at the federal level. And I don't know if you're keeping up on the news, but every day it seems like something changes that has an impact upon what we talk about in this class. I mean, this class couldn't really be more topical for what's going on in DC. But last week we talked about accountability and ethics. And one of the organizations we didn't talk a whole lot about last week is this organization called the Government Ethics, the Office of Government Ethics, or otherwise known as OGE, the Office of Government Ethics. The Office of Government Ethics is an executive branch organization that essentially kind of oversees all of the 140 agencies and departments across pretty much the entire federal bureaucracy. And the primary job of the Office of Government Ethics is to enforce conflict of interest laws and regulations. So what they will do is they will investigate any claims of conflict of interest. So if you have someone who has a financial interest in making a decision and they're involved in that decision, someone blows the whistle on that, as we talked about whistleblowers last week, the Office of Government Ethics can then review that and determine whether or not that truly was a valid conflict of interest. I'm only mentioning this because yesterday, or I think it was in the morning yesterday, President Trump relieved the director of the Office of Government Ethics from his position. So he was essentially fired yesterday. That individual was someone who was nominated by former President Biden about a year and a half ago. It was confirmed by the Senate in, I believe it was November, by a 50 to 46 vote. So he was nominated by the president, the former president, and was confirmed by the Senate. He'd only been on the job for 2 months, and he was beginning a 5-year term. Directors, you serve a 5-year term. And his term lasted 2 months because he was removed by President Trump. So that's one thing that's been done by the administration that has direct import on some of the information we covered last week. Also, the head of the Office of Special Counsel. Last week, when we talked about whistleblowing, we said that a lot of these whistleblower claims go to the Office of Special Counsel, the OSC. The director of the OSC has also been relieved of their duties and has been essentially fired by the administration. So we no longer have a head of the Office of Special Counsel. And I'd always mentioned to you that several, I think it was up to 18 of the 73 inspectors general that work in each of the federal agencies and departments overseeing ethics within those agencies and departments, 18 of those have also been fired by the administration. So in the whole downsizing approach to the federal government, we are seeing some of these ethics officials who are losing their jobs relatively quickly. And I just mentioned that not because there's any value judgment there, but just to say you can see how everyday news items actually have a direct impact upon what we talk about in this class. And so just kind of keep an eye on that and see what happens with these ethics officials, and if they are replaced, if they are not replaced, if any other ethics officials or inspectors general are removed from their position, that will have an impact upon the ability to hold federal employees accountable for their behavior and their practices. So it's just kind of a real quick epilogue to keep you up to date on what's going on with some of the concepts that we talked about in this class. Also, another thing that just broke today is a new executive order that instructs federal agencies and departments that they can only hire a new employee when they have 4 employees who leave. So it's kind of a 1-for-4 type of exchange. So if you have 4 people leave their positions, then you will be authorized to hire 1 person to replace those 4 people who are leaving. And again, that's all part of the attrition, the downsizing of the federal bureaucracy. We also, as of yesterday, still have a hold that's placed upon this quote unquote buyout for federal employees. And I use the term buyout in quotes because that's what mass media outlets are calling it. It's really not a buyout. And I think we had mentioned it before, maybe we mentioned it last week, that the Doge, which is the what's it called, the Department of Government Efficiency, I believe it's what it's called. But the Office of Government Efficiency, headed up by Elon Musk, they put out this call for resignations. And they said if you resign, then you'll be paid 8 months of your salary for essentially not doing any work, as long as you are gone by no later than, was it August, I believe, of this year. So you get paid 8 months as an incentive of your salary as an incentive to resign from your position. And today I saw the White House just update the numbers and said that 65,000 federal employees have taken up that offer. But a federal judge has placed a temporary restraining order on that memo that came out of Doge, saying that the deadline to accept the resignation offer, which was last Thursday at midnight, that deadline's not valid and that federal employees can still accept that offer. The temporary restraining order is there so that the judge can hear more testimony and get more affidavits filed to decide whether or not it's constitutional in order to make that offer to begin with. And so right now the offer is still there, but it's not being enforced as you have to do it by last Thursday. So 65,000 so far, it looks like, have accepted the offer, and we'll have to see what goes on with this decision by this federal judge and whether or not it's a permanent restraining order or not. We'll have to wait and see what happens with that. So things are moving very, very quickly, shifting sands, as we call it. So be sure to keep an eye on that because it really does have a direct impact upon a lot of the things we talk about here in this class. So let's get into what we need to talk about tonight, and that is a discussion of the idea of public administration and whether or not it is separate from private administration. Now, we know public administration and public bureaucracies, as we have said before, really do impact just about every aspect of our lives, from the cars we drive to the roads we drive on to the food we eat to the clothes we wear. Government bureaucracy is really encountered everywhere. Since people encounter bureaucracy in every aspect of their life, bureaucracy is very visible to people. The more visible something is, the more likely it is to be a very conflictual and contentious topic. So bureaucracy is certainly the source of a great deal of debate in this country. The whole idea of downsizing the federal bureaucracy is predicated on the idea that bureaucracies are inefficient, that they are overbloated, that they are impersonal, that they are full of waste, fraud, and corruption. So all those kind of negative associations we have with the word bureaucracy are all kind of the impetus behind this downsizing of the federal bureaucracy. Our goal in public administration, as we talked about last week, is administrative responsibility. So our goal, because we have so much of an interaction between the bureaucracy and the everyday lives of people, it's imperative that we have program implementation in the bureaucracy that is both efficient and effective while still holding these bureaucrats, these administrators, accountable to elected officials who are then being held accountable by the voters. But we see public administration, we see bureaucracy everywhere we look. So what is public administration? At its very heart, public administration is the study of public bureaucracy. Well, that's helpful, but then that begs the question, what is public bureaucracy? Public bureaucracy refers to public organizations. Public organizations are the formal, rational systems of relationships among people vested with administrative authority to carry out public programs. So public organizations are a formal, rational system of relationships among persons vested with administrative authority to carry out public programs. That's a really nice definition, but let's go and deconstruct it into its component elements. So first off, public organizations are formal in nature. And when you think about the organization in which you work, there's probably a lot of formality in that organization. The organization probably has a formal organization chart. that lays out for you all the different positions in the organization and how the different positions relate to each other. That is a formal organization chart. You probably have a formal set of policies and procedures in a policy and procedure manual. That is a formal declaration of how we go about doing our daily business. You probably have a position description in your job. That position description is a formal description of here are the tasks that you engage in on a daily basis, and here's the amount of time you spend on each one of those tasks. So there is a lot of formality in public organizations. There's also a lot of rationality. These relationships are rational in nature. Now, whenever we say something is rational, I think we all have a good sense of what rationality is. To be rational, we go out there and we collect all the information we can collect. We analyze that information, and then we use that information to render decisions. So we don't just make decisions based upon what we believe or what we feel. We make decisions based upon empirical, tangible information. That's a rational way of operating. So they're formal and they are rational, and they're comprised of systems of relationships among people. So relationships between employees, relationships between employees and managers, relationships between managers and leaders, relationships between administrators and elected officials, between administrators and the public. So we're looking at all these relationships that go on within the context of these public organizations. These people who are working within these organizations, these administrators, are vested with administrative authority to carry out public programs. They have this authority because the programs they are carrying out are created by a legislative body. They carry the force of law in enabling legislation. The money that they spend to carry out and implement these programs come via appropriations that also then come from a legislative organization. So by coming from enabling legislation and appropriations out of a legislative organization, it then carries this force of law. And that's the administrative authority that these administrators have to do what they do on a daily basis. And that formal authority, as we will see, is one of the major differences between public versus private administration. But we know that the word bureaucracy is not held in very high regard among members of the public. People, when they look at bureaucracies, feel that bureaucracies, as we said before, are full of red tape, that they're full of waste and fraud and corruption, that they're not very effective, and they certainly are not very efficient. And the common perception is that bureaucracies are too inefficient to accomplish much of anything of value. However, at the same point in time, people view the bureaucrats themselves as being very efficient abusers of their power. So people have a negative view of the bureaucracy itself, and they also tend to have a very negative view of the bureaucrats. And that negative view is really what's fueling a lot of these downsizing approaches of the current administration with the federal bureaucracy. So public administration studies public bureaucracies. Public bureaucracies are public organizations. The problem that public administration as a field of study has dealt with over its history is that it usually suffers from a crisis of identity, in that it really struggles to separate itself as distinct from private administration. And when you're getting your MPA degree, people may have thought you said MBA degree. They may ask you what an MPA degree is. When people ask me, what do you do for a living? I say, well, I'm a professor in an MPA program. First question is, what is that? And I tell them it's a Master of Public Administration. Their second question is, what is that? And then I have to describe what public administration is and how it is different from business administration. And that's something we always struggle with here in the field of public administration. But public administration is somewhat different than what's done in the private sector. And that's what we're going to spend the next few slides talking about. One of the main differences, as we already mentioned, between public and private administration is the role of public authority in the public sector. Again, enabling legislation, appropriations provide us with this legal authority that you oftentimes do not see over in the private sector. The authority in the private sector is market authority. In the public sector, it's more of a legal governmental authority. And secondly, we have some characteristic organizational processes that go on here in the public sector that look and feel somewhat different than what goes on in the private sector. How we hire people, how we retain employees, how we evaluate employees, how we generate money, our revenue coming from appropriations as opposed to coming from profit, how we are required to manage those appropriations. So there are a lot of those organizational processes that do look and feel a lot different in the public as compared to the private sector. In terms of a general similarity between the two sectors, both private as well as public organizations engage in what we call policy execution. Policy execution is carrying out public policies, actually implementing those public policies. Now, we know that public organizations are very involved in the implementation of public policies because that's their primary charge. That's why they exist, is to implement these public policies and these public programs. But a lot of our policies in this country are regulatory in nature, in that they regulate the behavior and actions of private corporations. In order to make those regulations effective, you have to have the acquiescence and the compliance of those private corporations. If those private corporations refuse to follow those regulations, then it becomes much more difficult to implement those regulations. So both sectors are involved in policy execution. However, it's really the public sector that's involved in policy formulation. So much more of a role for the public sector to play in policy formulation as opposed to the private sector. And we'll get more into that in a couple of seconds. One of the ways in which I like to distinguish between public and private organizations is this federal law that's known as the Anti-Deficiency Act. And I think it's a really good microcosm of the primary differences between the two sectors. So this is a federal law, the Federal Anti-Deficiency Act, that forbids government officials from spending on anything that is not explicitly authorized by law. So if this expenditure is not in an appropriation bill, if it's not explicitly authorized under law, you cannot spend money on that expenditure. So you can only spend on what the law tells you can spend money on. Contrast that to private organizations. Private organizations can spend on pretty much anything they want as long as those expenses are not forbidden by law. So they can do anything they want as long as it's not prohibited by law. So we are much more limited in the public sector in terms of how we can spend money and what we can spend money on. Now, this Anti-Deficiency Act is really topical because we have seen it used to push back on executive power over the past several years. I'll give you two examples. One example from the first Trump administration and a second example from this administration, just as of the past week. So the first example in the first Trump administration, there was a major piece of legislation that was passed in 2017 called the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was a major overhaul of the federal income tax system, the biggest change to the federal income tax system since 1986 in the Reagan administration with the Tax Reform Act. So it was a huge landmark piece of legislation. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act did a lot of different things, but just to kind of highlight some of the major things that happened in that piece of legislation, one thing that the act did is it greatly expanded the size of the standard deduction. Now, there have always been a lot of concerns about federal tax filing being very difficult and very cumbersome. And so in order to try and streamline it and make it easier for people to file, we want to encourage people to claim the standard deduction rather than itemizing their deductions. So by greatly increasing the size of the standard deduction, that amount that can be deducted from their adjusted gross income, you'll incentivize people to claim the standard deduction. When people itemize their deductions, it kind of slows down the process. It makes for a much more complicated tax form, not just for the tax filer, but also for the IRS to interpret and to make sure that everything is being done correctly and in accordance with law. Now, most people who own a home and having mortgage on their home are probably going to itemize their taxes because the interest that you pay on your mortgage is tax deductible. You can itemize that as a deduction from your adjusted gross income. And given the mortgage sizes and the house prices here in Southern California, usually the amount of money that you're paying on interest on your mortgage is greater than the amount of the standard deduction. So here people still tend to itemize if they own a home. But the goal was to get people to streamline their filing by claiming the standard deduction. In exchange for making a bigger standard deduction, the act then took away what were called exemptions. So before 2017, you could claim exemptions for each member of your household. And the idea here is it costs a lot more money to run a household of 6 people than it does to run a household of 1. And so you'd have an amount, usually it's like $2,600 for each member of your household that you could then deduct from your adjusted gross income. Those exemptions were taken away as a result of that legislation in exchange for a larger standard deduction. Then we had a lot of other changes, limitation placed upon what's called the SALT deduction, state and local tax deduction. So you can deduct the money that you pay to the local government for your property taxes, or the money that you pay to the state in terms of sales taxes. Those amounts of money can be deducted in this SALT deduction. What it did is it limited SALT deductions to $10,000, put a cap on it. That had a very negative impact upon taxpayers in high tax states, such as here in California, the state of New York, Massachusetts. Those high tax states, oftentimes the taxes that you pay to state and local governments will greatly exceed $10,000 in any given year, but you can only claim $10,000. So just some examples of what happened in this Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And also there are a whole litany of tax deductions that were added on. A small business tax deduction. If you have a home-based business, you have a new tax deduction. So a lot of new changes to the law. So that was passed in 2017. The problem was that after that legislation was passed, we then had a budget impasse. And that budget impasse eventually led to a partial government shutdown in January of 2018. One of the areas of government that was hit by this partial government shutdown was the Department of Treasury, in that the Treasury appropriation bill had not yet been passed. Well, what's one of the major agencies within the Department of Treasury? The IRS. So people, when it came time to start filing their taxes in January and February, had a lot of questions about what this new law meant for their taxes. So they got on the phone and they started calling the IRS. Well, the problem was because there was that partial government shutdown, those IRS agents who normally would be working customer service phones, they were furloughed. So they were at home. So the phone was ringing off the hook at the IRS. So citizens were complaining to the administration about, I can't file my taxes because there's nobody working at the IRS. So the Trump administration then wanted to call these IRS agents back to work and pay them. Well, the problem is there's no money to pay them with, because there was no appropriation that had been passed by Congress and signed by the president. So there was no legal authority to pay these IRS agents. Paying those IRS agents with money that's not legally appropriated would be a violation of this Anti-Deficiency Act. So that's a practical application of the Anti-Deficiency Act that occurred in the first Trump administration. Here in the second administration, with the quote unquote buyout offer that's been given to federal employees, that calls for paying them 8 months' salary for essentially not doing any work. Well, public employee unions have sued, saying that is a violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act, saying that that money for employee salaries, that was appropriated by Congress to compensate people for work that was being done. If these people are not doing any work for 8 months but still collecting their salary, the argument they're making is it's a violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act. And that's why that judge has placed a temporary restraining order on that quote unquote buyout. And so again, this Anti-Deficiency Act, I think, is a really great example of some of the limitations we have in the public sector in terms of decisions on how we are spending public taxpayer money. So it's a real good kind of microcosm of some of the differences between the public and private sectors. An even better discussion of the differences between public and private sectors comes to us from Graham Allison. And one of the articles you had to read tonight was out of the classics textbook, and that's Graham Allison's article looking at public and private management. Are they fundamentally alike in all unimportant respects? And so I hope you had a chance to take a look at the Allison article, because I think he makes a really compelling argument for there are some similarities between public and private sectors, but there are also some differences. So, in terms of the similarities between public and private sectors, Allison makes the argument that their similarities are in terms of the functions that they engage in. So, regardless of whether you're in a private organization or a public organization, all managers and organizations have to engage in certain basic functions to keep their organizations running. One of those basic functions, he says, is the function of planning. So all leaders and all managers have to strategically plan the operations of their organization. That is true in the public as well as the private sector. All leaders and managers have to organize their organizations. So they have to organize who does what and make sure that people are doing the tasks they're supposed to do. That's why we have these organization charts. They have to organize. All managers, regardless of sector, also have to engage in staffing. You have to get people into the organization who have the requisite skills, knowledge, skills, and abilities in order to be able to do the job efficiently and effectively. So public and private managers both have to staff up their organizations. They both engage in directing. They have to direct how work should be done. They both engage in coordination. They have to coordinate the work that's being done in the organization to make sure all the jobs are working together in order to meet the goals of the organization. So they have to coordinate the efforts of their employees. They all have to engage in reporting. They have to report on the work that is being done. They have to report on how the money is being spent. Financial reports are done both in the private as well as the public sectors. So you'll get financial reports out of both sectors. How they're done is a little different, but you get reports from both sectors. And then finally is budgeting. They have to get revenue, and they have to bring revenue into the organization in order to have the revenue to pay for their expenditures. Money is the lifeblood of any organization, whether it's in the public sector or in the private sector. So they both engage in budgeting. So these similarities, planning, organizing, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, and budgeting, have come to be known by the acronym POSCORP. That's just the acronym for planning, organizing, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, and budgeting. This idea of these essential functions being similar between the two sectors is what is also known as generic management theory. So generic management theory says there are these generic functions that are true regardless of what sector the organization is located in. So those are the similarities between public and private organizations, according to Allison. However, that is less important. Just sharing functions is less important, according to Allison, than how those functions are done. So what is similar is what they are doing. What is different is how they are doing them. So if you look at, for example, planning in the public versus the private sector, planning in the public sector tends to be much longer term in nature, and it also tends to be more subject to interventions. We have a lot of these crises that pop up that will stop us from planning. We have to go take care of the crisis, and then we can go back to planning. So there's a lot more intervention, a lot more interruption in planning in the public as compared to the private sector. So the how of planning is different between the two sectors. How we organize is different between those sectors as well. Typically in public organizations, we tend to see more extensive and more detailed organizational charts. We have more detailed division of work and specialization of tasks in public organizations. Staffing, how staffing is done, is much different between the sectors. If you are currently working in a public organization, when you got your job, it was probably a gradual, protracted process of being hired into that position. In the public sector, we do a lot of targeted recruitment so that we can fulfill the values of representative bureaucracy and make sure we have a diverse workforce that reflects the diversity in the population that it is serving. We do a lot of background checks, especially if we're dealing with sensitive, confidential type of information. So whereas in the private sector, these are at-will employees who can be hired essentially on the spot, in the public sector, it might take you 3, 6, 9 months in order to get your job in a public sector organization. So staffing, how we hire, is much different. How we retain employees is much different as well. Private employees are at-will employees, so they kind of serve at the discretion and at the pleasure of the organization. So the organization can get rid of an employee, an at-will employee, for pretty much whatever reason it wants to, as long as that reason is not prohibited by law. So as long as they're not discriminatory, they can use that as a reason for dismissing an employee. In the public sector, though, these public employees are career civil servants. They are protected with their civil service regulations. They are also protected by the stipulations in the collective bargaining agreement if they're unionized. So there are a lot more steps we have to go through in terms of how we manage human resources in the public as compared to the private sector. Directing is different in how that is done as well. There's much more persuasion in the public sector as compared to being able to micromanage and direct employees in the private sector. Coordination is different in the public sector. We have a lot of different people in our organizations doing a lot of different types of jobs. We have our organization that is entering into networks and collaboration with other organizations. So it makes it much more difficult to coordinate activities in the public compared to the private sector. We said both sectors do reporting, but how that reporting is done is different. In the public sector, that reporting, especially that financial reporting, is something that is done in the open. If you want to know about the finances, say, for example, of a city, you go to their website. Their city budget will be right there on the website for anyone to download and review. They'll also have what's referred to as their annual comprehensive financial report. That will be up there for download and review by any member of the public. Their expenditures are going to be monitored through auditing processes. And so those audits will have to be conducted, if not annually, will sometimes have to be conducted twice a year. In my district, we would have to do twice a year audits for not only our daily expenditures, but also for our capital expenditures as well. We would also have to have the auditor come into an open meeting, a public meeting, and discuss their findings in terms of that audit report. And that audit report was then presented in front of the public, and then the public could then make comments and observations about that. A much more open, let the sun shine in process in terms of reporting. And as I mentioned before, in budgeting, in the public sector, we rely upon appropriations. In the private sector, they rely upon profits. That's a major difference. Appropriations tend to be much more stable from one year to the next as opposed to profits. When you have very stable appropriations that you're relying upon, there's less of an impact or less of a concern, if you will, about efficiency, because you know that you are going to get essentially the same appropriations next year as you got this year, maybe plus or minus 1, 2, or 3%. In the private sector, those profits that were there this year may not be there next year. You may have an influx of competitors into the market. You may have an influx of regulations that are going to cost you more money on the production side. So there are a lot of things that can really reduce your profits from one year to the next. And so you really have to focus on efficiency, not knowing if that profit is going to come in future years. So again, Allison tells us the what is very similar between the sectors, but it's really the how those functions are done that is really what differentiates between a public versus a private organization. So let's drill down a little bit more in terms of these differences in these processes and how they are done in the public sector. First, as we've already said, in the public sector, we have a career civil service. Career civil service servants are hired based upon their qualifications. So it's a merit-based system of hiring. They have to demonstrate they have the requisite knowledge, skills, and abilities to do the job. They can do that perhaps through an examination process. More likely today, they're going to do it through a more holistic review of knowledge, skills, and abilities. But these are people who are hired based upon their merit, and they retain their positions based upon merit as well. Private sector, they're at-will employees. As at-will employees, it's much easier to terminate an at-will employee than it is a career civil servant. In addition to them having career civil service protections in the public sector, as we already mentioned, they also oftentimes have union protections as well. So if they belong to a public employee union, there will be a collective bargaining agreement, a contract that will add on more protections on top of their basic career civil service protections. How we measure performance in the public versus the private sector will also be different. In the public sector, the types of things that we are creating, the goods and services we're creating, are oftentimes what we refer to as softer goods and services, in that they're more qualitative, they're more difficult to measure. So things such as enhancing the quality of life of a certain segment of your population. Enhancing the quality of life is something that's much more subjective in nature than if you're in the private sector and you're producing what economists like to talk about widgets, the mythical widgets. You can really assess those widgets in terms of their quality. You can have quality control. Does this widget look like the other widget that we are producing? It's a much more quantitative, empirical way of measuring performance. Public sector, we have a lot of competing standards. So we have standards that are imposed upon us by the national government, standards imposed upon us by state governments, standards imposed upon us by executive, legislative, and judicial branches. So a lot of these standards that actually oftentimes come into conflict with each other. In the public sector, we're oftentimes subject to a lot more public scrutiny. We have what we call the fishbowl effect. And so since we are managing public taxpayer money, we have to be held accountable to the public. And so there's a lot of media and a lot of public scrutiny, more so in the public as compared to the private sector. Persuasion. We have to rely upon persuasive abilities as public leaders and managers, much more so than private sector managers are required to do. Because of all these limitations from career civil service and collective bargaining agreements, we oftentimes don't have the ability to tell someone this is what you have to do and expect them to do exactly that. We have to engage more in persuasion. And then the oversight. As we talked about when we talked about accountability and ethics last week, we are held accountable through the oversight process to legislative bodies, to the chief executive and executive agencies, to the judicial branch, to national governments, to state governments. There's a lot more oversight in terms of the many masters that we serve as public organizations. But whenever you ask people about the differences between the public and private sector, where probably 99% of the public will go is the idea of profit, that there is a profit motive in the private sector and a lack of a profit motive over in the public sector. That is true for the most part. But I think this is one of those examples of profit being a necessary condition for the differences between the two sectors, but not sufficient. That there is a difference in terms of profit motive, but that is not alone enough to distinguish between the two different sectors. And the reason for that is if you look in the public sector, there are some public organizations that operate to run a profit. Those are called government corporations. So something like the US Postal Service is a government corporation. It's a public organization, is essentially owned and overseen by Congress, but it has the ability to run a profit. It usually doesn't run a profit, but it does have the ability to run a profit, much like any private corporation would do. So we have government corporations, we have government-sponsored enterprises in the public sector. In the private sector, we also have private non-governmental organizations that are nonprofits. So our nonprofit organizations, they are private in nature. They are not owned by government, but they do not run a profit. So profit alone is not enough to distinguish between the two sectors. Another way that we can distinguish between the two sectors is by looking at what they do in terms of the types of goods and services that they produce. Public organizations are going to be much more likely to provide and produce what we consider to be true public goods. Private organizations are going to be more likely to provide and produce what we consider to be true private goods. So what's the difference between a public and a private good? And this is something you'll talk about at length when you get into your PPA 555 public budgeting course. But the primary difference between a public and a private good is twofold. The one difference is that public goods tend to be what we call non-excludable. You cannot exclude people from getting benefits of a public good just because you can't charge them for those benefits. So true public goods are non-excludable. They also tend to be non-exhaustible in that they cannot be used up. So let's look at an example of national defense. National defense is usually offered up as the quintessential classic example of a true public good. National defense is seen as being uh, unable to exclude, so it's non-excludable. So you get a benefit from having national defense, feeling of being at peace and being safe. I get that same feeling, or maybe even more of a feeling or less of a feeling of being safe. But we both derive benefits from national defense, and the benefits we get will not be indexed to the amount of money we're paying in taxation. So you cannot charge people for the benefits that they're getting from national defense. Therefore, it's non-excludable. Then in terms of being non-exhaustible, just because I get a benefit from national defense doesn't erode the benefit that you get from national defense. We can both enjoy a benefit from national defense, which again makes national defense kind of that true public good. So public goods are non-excludable. You can't charge people, and they are non-exhaustible. The opposite end of the spectrum, you have private goods. Private goods are excludable and they are exhaustible. So you think about something as simple as a candy bar that is sitting on the shelf of a convenience store. It is excludable. So, you and I both go in there, and if I don't have the money to pay for this candy bar, then I don't get to purchase a candy bar. I don't get to consume it. I don't get the benefits of that candy bar. I've been excluded because of chargeability. It's also exhaustible that if you and I go into that convenience store, we both want that candy bar. You are younger than I am and more spry than I am, so you're able to get to the candy bar first. You eat the candy bar, it is exhausted, and it's no longer available for me. So that candy bar is a truly private type of good. Well, so what is the question? The so what question is, again, public goods tend to be publicly provided and produced. Private goods tend to be privately provided and produced. Which then kind of begs this question about this differentiation we're making between provision and production. And there is a difference between provision and production. Provision speaks to giving the resources to make the production process possible. So if you think about this within the context of an MPA program, so the fees that you pay as a student in the program, the subsidies that we get from the state of California, which those are getting smaller and smaller every single year since I've been here, but those fees, those subsidies, those are the resources that make production possible. That's provision. Production is actually what's going on right here now. This is the courses, the education that you're getting in the MPA program. So that's the difference between provision and production. So in public goods, we tend to see both public provision and production. In private goods, we see both private provision and production. Those are the easy cases. The more difficult ones are the ones that fall in between the extremes of a true private and a true public good. So there are two other types of goods that public economists will tell us fall in between those extremes. There's what are referred to as toll goods and what are referred to as common pool goods. A toll good is a good that is excludable, but it is non-exhaustible. So you think about something as simple as a toll road. You pull up to the toll road. If you've paid the toll, the arm goes up and you get to drive on the toll road. If you don't pay the toll, the arm stays down. You're excluded from driving on that toll road. So it is excludable. But it's non-exhaustible in that everyone who pays that toll, the bar will go up for, and they can then drive on that toll road. So that's what's called a toll good. Then the opposite of a toll good is a common pool good. A common pool good tends to be non-excludable, but it is exhaustible. So something like natural resources, access to natural resources, access to mineral pools, that type of thing is considered a common pool good. We should not be excluding people because those resources belong to all of us. But once we use them up, they are gone. So they are exhaustible. So they're non-excludable, but they are exhaustible. So based upon the type of good, we can then get some insight into whether or not this is something that's provided and produced by the public or by the private sector or by a mixture of the two. When we mix the two, and we have government provision and private sector production, that's when we have this idea of privatization. So the most common type of privatization, as you probably already know, is contracting out. So we contract out, we'll have the public sector or public agency will put out a request for proposals. That request for proposals will then go out to, say, for instance, contractors. Contractors will then submit their sealed bids to that public agency. At a given time and date, the agency will open up those sealed bids, and then they will award that contract usually to the lowest responsible and responsive bidder. Responsible bidder is one who is financially responsible, meaning that here in California, they are bonded and insured, meaning here in California that they are registered with the Department of Industrial Relations. That makes them financially, fiscally responsible. And the bid has to be responsive, meaning that the bid is responsive to all the things that were asked for in the request for proposal. So whenever that happens, we select the lowest responsible and responsive bid. We then award the contract to that contractor. That contract is paid for by government. So government resources are being used to provide for paying for that contract. The actual construction of that building, that's going to be done by that private contractor. That's production. So that's government provision and private sector production. That is the most common approach to privatization that we currently see in this country. However, there is the potential, it doesn't happen a lot, but there is the potential for private provision and government production. So think about a scenario where you have a private concert promoter and they want to put on a concert at a venue. They want to have security at that concert. So they issue a contract with the local police department, and they will then pay officers of the local police department to actually come to the venue and to actually produce the security, to actually do the security. That contract is being paid for by the private entity, the concert promoter. The security is actually being produced by government employees. That would be private provision and government production. But again, that's a much more unusual type of an arrangement. But depending upon the type of good, it will give us some insight into, is this something that public sector should do? Is this something that the private sector should do? So another difference, public sector tends to do public types of goods, private sector tends to do private sector types of goods. Those goods in between that share some private and component elements, that's where we see a lot of discussions about privatization and whether or not privatization is something that should be pursued for that good or that service. And then to go back to this other difference that we presented earlier on a few slides ago, another main difference between public and private sectors is in terms of policy formulation versus policy execution. As we said, public and private organizations are both engaged in policy execution and implementation. You know, this we're talking about execution. It's the same thing as implementation. So in your 670 course, your policy analysis course, you'll talk about policy implementation. It's kind of the same thing as execution. It's actually putting this policy into effect. To put the policy into effect, to implement the policy, obviously most of our policies are going to flow through government agencies, and so they therefore flow through the public sector, and it's going to be public administrators who are directly responsible for properly implementing these policies. When we are looking at the private sector, as we said, if it's a regulatory policy, then we're going to need the compliance of the private sector to make that effective. And so the private sector is also then oftentimes involved in policy implementation execution. However, the big difference is that it's usually the public sector that's much more involved in policy formation than the private sector. And public administrators today contribute greatly to the policy formulation process. So in terms of policy execution, as we said, that is the task of public administration, where public administrators translate law into action, actually implement those laws that have been created by either a chief executive or by a legislative body. Policy formulation is when administrators are involved in advising elected officials before the policy is formulated, before the policy is made. Those elected officials will reach out to administrators and agencies to draw upon their expertise. Because who knows best how to implement a policy than those people who will actually be implementing that policy? So the advice you give to elected officials, that is part of the policy formulation process. Even after the policy is made, even after the policy is passed in Congress or a state legislature, that policy is still probably going to be relatively vague and ambiguous. So, in order to fill in all those blanks in that policy, we oftentimes have to rely upon administrators to engage in the administrative rulemaking process. And the Administrative Procedures Act, APA of 1946, lays out the rulemaking process. And so, essentially, what administrators will do in order to write the rules to properly implement this policy, they will propose a rule. They will then publish that rule for the public to see. They will then invite public comments on that rule, and people can write in their comments, or people can come to a public hearing and actually give their comments in a public hearing. Then there's kind of a cooling off period where you have to wait 60 days after that before the rule can then become official. So there's a lot of public input in terms of rulemaking. But by making these rules on how this policy will be implemented, you're kind of engaging in formulation as well, because those rules will really dictate how that policy is implemented and how effective that policy will be. So over the past several decades, we have seen more and more involvement of public administrators in policy formation. And by having public administrators involved in policy formulation, we have seen two major outcomes that have accrued because of that. One of the major outcomes that have come about because of administrator involvement in policy formation is an increased technicality of public policies. Because you have these experts involved in the formation of the policy, they are going to bring a lot more technical analysis into that advice that they are giving to the elected officials, which will increase the technicality of the public policies that are being formulated. A second thing that has happened is by having administrators involved in policy formation, since those administrators are coming from the executive branch and they are under the control of the chief executive, it has greatly increased the chief executive's role in terms of policy making. One thing we oftentimes overlook in Article 2 of the US Constitution is that Article 2 tells us presidents recommend legislation to Congress, which makes presidents chief legislators. Now, we don't talk about it a lot. We always, in our old civics courses, say, well, Congress comes up with legislation, they pass it, and then the president signs it, and then it's implemented by the bureaucracy. Well, it's not that simple. A lot of legislation that's considered by Congress comes from the president. So the president makes these legislative recommendations to his party or her party, their party in Congress, and then it's up to that party to then decide how to pass that legislation. And so you see the president taking on this heightened role in terms of policy formation. So it really does make a difference that we have administrators involved in not only policy execution, but also policy formation. The upshot of this to always remember is that when administrators are involved in policy formulation, they are working with politicians, they're working with elected officials, but their motivations are oftentimes different. Hopefully, the motivation of an administrator who's involved in policy formulation will be the making of good policy. The motivation of elected officials in policy formation will oftentimes be to get reelected. So to claim credit for legislation that's very popular, that will appeal to their constituents to help them get reelected. So even though they are both responsible for policy formation, they oftentimes have different types of motivations. And yes, Sarah is correct in text chat saying, do administrators work in think tanks? Typically in think tanks, if it's someone who's a federal employee, hopefully they're not actively involved working in a think tank as they are a federal employee, because that could certainly be a conflict of interest. Now, I don't know how concerned we are about conflicts of interest anymore at the federal government, but that could be a conflict of interest. In think tanks, we tend to see a lot of academics who are involved in think tanks. And My former dissertation chair, who's now retired from academia, he's a fellow with the Brookings Institute, which is a think tank. So oftentimes we have academics who are very involved in think tanks, but whenever a federal administrator becomes involved in the think tank, you got to ask some questions about, is there that type of conflict of interest? Because if they're involved in the think tank is promoting a certain policy agenda, is that individual then going to be promoting that policy agenda on the behalf of their organization rather than just trying to make good policy? So there are some lines that we want to try not to cross in terms of ethical adherence. So hopefully this discussion we've had up to this point in time kind of clarifies some of the similarities, but some of the major differences between public and private sectors. And our primary goal for talking about these differences between the sectors is to provide us with a basis for understanding why we have this separate field of public administration and why we have MPA degrees that are offered out of the Graduate Center for Public Administration, the SPA building, as opposed to the MBA degree that's offered by business faculty out of the College of Business. So there are some major differences in how we engage in our functions that help to substantiate the rationale for having a separate study of public administration. So we've been going for a while now, so I think we probably deserve a bit of a break. So let's take a break until, well, let's say we'll take a break until 5:35. Give you a little bit of extra time. And then when we come back at 5:35, I'm going to stop talking for a while because I know I talked a whole lot the last 2 weeks. I've talked a lot so far tonight. I want to take a break from that. And after we come back from our break, I want to put you into some breakout rooms and then have each group in the breakout rooms think about the idea of privatization and think about the idea of when governments contract out to private sector corporations and selecting one policy area. So each group will select a policy area, and then within that policy area, assess the advantages to privatization. What types of aspects of that policy are amenable to privatization, and then what are some of the challenges of privatizing within that policy area? Because every time we privatize, we are by definition limiting the role and the functions of government and supplanting those roles and functions with the private sector. So going back to those different types of goods that we discussed a couple of slides ago. So let's take a break, and then we come back at 5:35. We'll go ahead and get into our group, spend about a half hour, 40 minutes, and then after we're done with that, we'll reconvene as a class, see what each group came up with, and I think that will probably take us through the end of our session tonight. So take a break and come on back at 5:35.